Greetings, everyone. Hello. Great to see so many people joining us today, familiar faces and new attendees as well. Welcome. My name is Cristian Hernandez-Blick. I'm the head of program at Interspecies Internet, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the trustees in the organization to our first Interspecies Conversations lecture of the new year. Interspecies Conversations is a monthly online lecture series where leading thinkers share ideas and research that contributes to advancing our understanding of communication in other species, often engaging with related work in animal cognition, behavior, conservation, and welfare. We aim to showcase emerging ideas and discoveries and host open discussions where the community can join the conversation with questions and feedback. And if you enjoyed today's talk, please consider donating to Interspecies Internet to help support our programming, events, and other projects and activities. You can find a donation link on our website, interspecies.io, as well as in the video descriptions on our YouTube channel. So today we are very excited to introduce César Rodríguez-Garavito, who will be delivering his talk, Listening to the More Than Human World, Legal and Ethical Principles for Non-Human Animal Communication Technologies. César is an Earth rights scholar, field lawyer, and founding director of the More Than Human Life program at NYU School of Law. He is a professor of clinical law and director of the Earth Rights Research and Action Clinic at NYU Law. His work has advanced new ideas and legal actions on issues such as climate justice, indigenous rights, and what he proposes to call more than human rights, or the rights of nature. His ongoing MOTH initiatives include a partnership with Project CETI on the legal implications of AI-assisted translation of sperm whale communication, as well as collaborations with the Fungi Foundation and the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks on legal actions to protect the fungal kingdom of life. His recent publications include More Than Human Rights and Ecology of Law, Thought and Narrative for Earthly Flourishing, and a forthcoming book titled Climate Change on Trial, Mobilizing Human Rights Litigation to Accelerate Climate Action. In his presentation, Garavito will delve into the rapidly developing field of non-human animal communications technologies, otherwise known as NACTs, exploring the potential benefits and risks they pose to non-human well-being, as well as existing legal and regulatory gaps. In response to a lack of governing frameworks for the field, the MOTH program will, in collaboration with experts across a range of disciplines, including animal welfare, human and animal research ethics, environmental law, data governance, and artificial intelligence, to develop a draft set of proposed legal and ethical principles for the responsible development of NACTs. Workshops by leading scientists and practitioners during a November event co-hosted by MOTH and Project SETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative. The principles intend to establish a robust, integrated, and iterative framework capable of guarding against the risks raised by NACTs to the environment, non-human animals, and the human communities in long-standing relationships with them. So César, once again, we're so happy to have you with us today. And take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Cristian, and thanks everyone for attending on a Saturday. I was not expecting such a big crowd on a Saturday, but I see that you have a highly mobilized constituency here. So I'm glad to see that. As Cristian said, the collective that I lead here at NYU Law, the More Than Human Life Collective, which started with a different name, the More Than Human Rights Project, but then grew and included a number of non-lawyers and non-social scientists who are quite interested in questions of the legal implications and the ethical implications of scientific research, which I imagine is what brings many of you to this conversation. As Cristian said, we collaborate with a number of scientists in different disciplines, mycologists, botanists, biologists, ecologists, and we have a number of research projects that also have a practical implication to them. So just to go back to one of the projects that was mentioned by Cristian, we work with mycologists to try to protect fungi-rich ecosystems that are not protected by regular environmental legal frameworks, because they usually focus on animals and plants. So the spirit in everything that we do is to try to expand the horizon and the possibilities of existing legal and ethical frameworks for the purposes of advancing the protection of non-humans as well as humans. And before I launch into the presentation, I wanted to offer a couple of caveats. First, I was asked to talk about both the opportunities and the risks arising from what we call NACTs and non-animal communication technologies. So I'll do just that, but I'll do it in an asymmetrical way, because we have already finalized the work on opportunities, and in fact we have a paper coming out in the top environmental law journal next month, at least the SSRN version of it, that is all about the opportunities for the protection of sperm whales and other animals that arise from the findings of Project SETI and other similar collectives, although we focus on Project SETI because that's our partner organization in that project. So I'll speak about that paper and those findings at some length, because those have been peer-reviewed, they're ready to go, and they're finalized. The work on risks and guardrails is ongoing, as Cristian said. We workshopped an initial version of the guardrails and the principles in November. So we're still working on the new iteration of those guardrails. So I'm limited in the terms of the amount of detail that I can give, because we're still working on the guardrails and the principles, but I will give you a sense of where we're going, and I will at the very least offer you a high-level version of the principles, because we, of course, at this point have a pretty good sense of where we're going with this project. So, and I'm hoping that there will be, and definitely I will make sure that I leave enough time for discussion, because especially with the guardrails, but also with the opportunities paper, we're very much in the initial stages. This is a widely new and exciting field, and what I've learned by working on this partnership with Project SETI over the last 18 months or so is that as we dig deeper, more and more questions emerge. For Project SETI, of course, on the scientific side of things, so I will not be able to answer any questions on the robotics or the AI technology or even the recording technologies, although I have been to the field a couple of times with the Project SETI, and I've been in conversations with the fantastic group of scientists of Project SETI. Of course, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert, and I'm not a marine biologist. So my expertise is I was trained as a lawyer and as a sociologist. My PhD is sociology, so I'm a social scientist and a lawyer, and I approach all these issues from that angle. So with that, I'll start sharing my screen here. Let's see. You can see it. Can you see it? Okay. Okay, so I'll skip this part. I've given part of this presentation with David Gruber in the past, and he takes care, of course, of all the bioacoustics and the science aspect of it. I am assuming that people are familiar with the studies of Project SETI and other collectives that are using AI, robotics, complexity science to find patterns in communications among the case of SETI sperm whales, but in the case of other collectives, of course, among other members of other species. What we're doing here, and this is the starting point for the work of MOTH and MOTH's contribution to this work, is that we're very much interested, and this is one of our points of departure in all of our work. We treat non-human animals as subjects as opposed to objects. For some of you, that may be commonsensical, but it's not that way for the law in most jurisdictions and for most laws. Non-human animals continue to be treated as objects, as property to a greater or lesser extent in most jurisdictions, in all jurisdictions, even those jurisdictions that do have strong protections for rights of nature, like Ecuador, or in some cases, jurisdictions like New Zealand. So what we're doing here is trying to challenge this less circular, less inclusive view of the chain of being. This goes back to Aristotle, right? With human beings at the top and then primates right below, and then everyone else at the bottom, which of course you will be familiar with. So the question is, what happens when you consider sperm whales and other animals as subjects, as rights holders? To what extent do the findings of Project SETI and other collectives help advance this non-anthropocentric view of the law? And this is exactly what the project on opportunities is about. And the background to this effort is at least a 50-year effort by animal rights advocates and scholars to try to address the usual objections that both scholars and practitioners raise when the proposition is made to extend rights to non-human animals. 50 years ago, almost exactly, Peter Singer inaugurated this wave of effervescence of highly fruitful wave of studies that has mainstreamed the idea that at least sentient animals should be considered as subjects of rights, as subjects of special protection. But then the question is, as animals from primates to many others were shown to be sentient, the law in most jurisdictions has continued to raise the bar. So sentience is no longer considered enough to extend rights to non-human animals. And there's an open and very vibrant debate about all of these criteria, including intelligence, consciousness. You may have seen the New York Declaration on animal consciousness, which was actually presented here at NYU last year. But what's interesting and most relevant for the purposes of this conversation is that language has been seen kind of as the ultimate, as the highest bar, as the bar that surely animals will not clear. So in some judgments in the US and elsewhere, the objection by judges and by scholars and practitioners who are not supportive of extending rights to animals is, well, they may be sentient, they may exhibit some form of intelligence, they may even have some sort of awareness, but surely they do not have the capacity for complex language. And this is why the field of bioacoustics and the work of SETI and the whole field is so fascinating, but also challenging to that mainstream of the legal field. Because, and I quote from a very well-known moral philosopher, Martha Nussbaum, who once wrote, legal progress will be slower for non-human animals because their voices are not recorded and they don't participate directly in public policy. And she is an animal rights philosopher. She's made very forceful and convincing efforts at extending rights at least to some categories of animals. But even for her, this is the bar that cannot be attained, or at least hasn't quite been attained by animals, that would be a game changer if only their voices could be recorded and they could participate directly in public policy, then the legal process would be completely transformed, is the implication, of course, of this quote. And the question is, what if? Well, what if through non-animal communication technology, which is, I'm going to call NACTs or NACTs going forward. I know it's not one of the things we're working on. Is a better acronym because it's not quite sonorous, but for now, I'll call it NACTs, non-human animal communication technologies. What if they did, as some say, they did break the interspecies communication barrier? And this is the from now on, I'm gonna rely heavily on the paper that we're publishing soon. The idea here is that just as we're finding that there's many of you may have read this book, that there's an immense world that we haven't been able to understand and appreciate because we haven't had the technologies and science hasn't paid enough attention. They have the tools to, for example, understand how bees communicate with each other, how they have ways of so complex forms of social organization that are coordinated through their moves and through the use of their bodies, and how elephants can have unique names and so on. What if the proposition here is that non-animal communication technologies can also open an immense legal world? And the question here is, what exactly those transformations in the legal field, the legal protection of animals would be if two things were done? And this is the collaboration with SETI. So I'm going to tackle two different questions, and I want to make sure that these are clearly understood. We're probing two different questions. The first one is, what if it was proved that cetaceans, and from now on, I'm going to stay with cetaceans because that's the framing of the paper, and also, of course, all of SETI's science is on sperm whales communication. What if it was proved that cetaceans have capacity for language? And the second question is, what if the content of cetaceans' communications was understood? And the distinction between these two questions is important because whereas it's clear, at least as far as we know, no scientific collective has gotten as far as understanding the content of cetaceans' communication. It is also true that SETI's peer-reviewed publications from last year already show that that sperm whales have capacity, or at least the building blocks for complex language. One of the co-authors in the paper is Gasper Begus, well-known, very well-known and pioneering linguist out of the University of Berkeley, and he's discussed this at length in his own work. So I would refer to his work if you're interested in why he's comfortable saying that this is that we have through papers like the sperm whales alphabet paper that SETI published last year, enough evidence to at least entertain the possibility that sperm whales do have building blocks that are that suggest that they possess the capacity for complex language. And so I'm going to explore those two questions separately, knowing that the capacity for language, the science of capacity for language is much more well established, whether there's the science on the content of communications is still evolving. And this is the paper in the Ecology Law Quarterly that we wrote, that David and I wrote with Gasper and my colleague Ashley Nemeth here at NYU. So let's start with, what if it was proved that cetaceans have capacity for knowledge? In the legal field, the legal field works by analogy. When you litigate a case, when you propose a legal and ethical framework, we make the distinction in the law between soft law and hard law. Soft law are non-binding principles and rules, things like declarations. Last year, some of you may have seen that indigenous leaders from the different Polynesian islands adopted and agreed on a treaty on cetaceans' rights. That is, for the moment, soft law in that it cannot be enforced by any state or court as is, but it may become hard law if it is incorporated into into court rulings or into national legislation, or through other forms it becomes binding. So both soft law and hard law evolve all the time, and the way that the law tends to evolve is by analogy, meaning it would be the most natural way for cetaceans' rights to be protected going forward would be to say, well, primates have been granted some rights in some jurisdictions, so we should do the same for cetaceans. Elephants have been protected in some jurisdictions, and they're because they have been shown to communicate with each other or have other capacities, then we should do the same with cetaceans. And this is something that we're doing. I don't have the time to elaborate, but I'm happy to do so in the Q&A. But in addition to doing research, MOTH does undertake practical experiments, as we call them, legal actions that tests some of these ideas and propositions in court or before in administrative agencies in different parts of the world. So one natural and already existing avenue for extending rights is through litigation. So I can see, I can anticipate easily, this is no longer easy to predict, that some of those findings in coming out of collectives like SETI will be used in litigation to extend and strengthen the protection of cetaceans for against threats like noise pollution or ship traffic and so on. There's also the avenue of legislation, which I think is pretty straightforward. And then there are more kind of local avenues for the incorporation of the findings, for example, through animal research. If it becomes established that animals like cetaceans have the capacity for complex language, that may lead some legislators or some academic boards to raise the bar in terms of the type of experimentation, legal or the conditions under which animal research with those subjects can be undertaken. Then, so that's in the paper we say and we show and we go into great length to show how even existing legislation in the US, for example, on marine protection or legislation on endangered species can already be reinterpreted more expansively, given that there is emerging science that shows that cetaceans, specifically sperm whales, have capacity for complex communication. Then this part is more futuristic, although some observers and some practitioners of this type of science are quite confident that some of them will be able to understand at least some of the content of those communications in the near future. But this is still in the future, it's not the present reality. But if that future were to happen, the question is, what type of impact would it have on law and policy? And I'm going to give you one specific example, because this is where, of course, our research takes a page or two from human rights law and frameworks. Because, of course, since we're treating sperm whales and cetaceans as subjects of rights, then the existing 75-year-old framework that protects humans against forms of violation of their physical or moral integrity should also be helpful and instructive. So I'll give you one example that is, of course, well known to those of you who work on cetaceans, which is the fact that in the case of sperm whales, for instance, the fact, and I know that this is an accurate drawing, and David has told me a couple of times that I should change it, and I haven't done so because I know that the sperm whales don't quite talk from their mouths. So bear with me, I'm the lawyer, not the scientist here. So but of course, if, as we know, whales are highly auditory animals, that they don't use their eyes the way that we do, and that their whole perceptual world depends on how much they can hear and how much their voices and their codas and their communications can be heard by other members of the species, then noise pollution, which is on the rise, as we know, because of ship traffic, becomes a major form of disruption of their worlds and actually a form of threat to their physical integrity. And there is one of the most well-established rights in the human rights framework is the right against torture. That for obvious reasons. It was developed as a form of protection against the worst forms of treatment in the context of political repression or war, and things like flashing a light right into the eyes of a human being became widely considered forms of torture that were banned and that admitted no exceptions, because of course they were considered, at least on paper, unfortunately not necessarily always in practice, unacceptable and contrary to the basic tenets of human rights law. The argument that we're making, and that one that I would personally like to test in the future, is bringing a case that shows that given what we know about animal communication or sperm whale communication, the fundamental disruption of their communications and their the constant noise and the masking of their communications caused by ship traffic amounts to a form of torture. And that is one specific implication, concrete implication of the new science that is being produced by NACT. So just to recap, if the content of cetacean communications were understood, one can think of ways of reinforcing the application of existing norms, of advancing new animal rights and forms of legal personhood. I already explained the reason why I think there's a very strong case to argue that based on these findings of NACTs, we have evidence, even more evidence, there was already evidence, but even more evidence that noise pollution is a form of torture. Of course, now there are ways to understand that the sperm whales' lives are being disrupted by ship noise, but if the content of what they're saying could be understood, and clear messages of suffering or of disruption can be captured and understood, that you can imagine what that would mean for a lawyer taking a case against a source of noise pollution to court. And the other argument, this is just, we chose these two illustrations because among many implications of the potential understanding of the content of cetacean communications, because they get at two very different aspects or of the findings from these studies. The other one, and I'm sure that when the paper is published, this is going to be um, is going to give rise to interesting conversations. Is we argue that given that part of what scientists like SETI are finding, not just through bioacoustics, but also by using drones to record interactions. You may have seen that they famously were able to record the birth of a baby whale a couple of years ago. That and working on papers that show there's complex social interactions among many, mostly female whales in the birth event, and that many other scientists, even before bioacoustics, aided by AI, had shown that whales have complex social lives. In fact, that they have cultures, that they live in culture, they have dialects, and they have ways of living with each other that are distinct and different from those of other whale pods. That fits well. This is our argument now as lawyers. The definition of culture for the purposes of the protection of the right to a cultural life. So it's not just the body or the individual life that gets disrupted by noise. I'm keeping with noise for now to make the example simpler, but it's also their sociability and the cultural life, and given that there is such a thing as a right to cultural life, because for highly sociable species like human beings, living in a culture is part of their basic well-being, that the new science and the NACTs can bolster the case for arguing that these disruptions amount to a violation of the right to cultural life. So I'll end by just flagging, as I said, we're not ready to share all the details of the principles because we're still working on them. It'll take us a couple of more months before they are ready to be shared. But we have enough, of course, at this point for me to be able to at least give you a high-level version of the list of principles that we're working on to address risks and challenges. So again, I'm going to go through the risks and challenges very quickly because in this audience, I think that it can be pretty obvious. But with opportunities come risks, and the risks of these technologies are as serious as the opportunities. One risk and challenge is the manipulation of animals for profit and other forms of exploitation. Right? If they're being monitored constantly, if the content of their communications is understood, you can imagine what everyone from ill-intentioned ecotourism operators to large-scale fishery operations can do with the new tools, and that's been widely discussed, for example, in the context of elephant research and the potential of those technologies falling in the hand of poachers. And so it is this type of risk that we're worrying about here, the deployment of the same tools to further exploit and manipulate animals' lives. Then the second one is less straightforward, at least in my experience in talking to scientists about this. By the way, I'll explain the process through which we've developed these principles, but one key aspect of it has been conversations with many scientists about what they think are the main risks and challenges and what the potential responses to those could be. And some of them, including some of Project SETI's scientists who care deeply about the well-being of the whales and who have been among the first ones to work with us on these guardrails. And by the way, this part is also done, although MOTH does all the legal and ethical guardrails work, all of the work has been done in collaboration and partnership with Project SETI. So infringements on autonomy, right? So what should be the sphere of autonomy of an animal in the wild, like a sperm whale in the ocean? And here's where the guidance from human rights law hits a wall. It does help, and we have drawn on human rights law to develop these guardrails, but also autonomy and privacy, which is a much more charged term, um, have a very specific meaning when it comes to humans. So the question is, when is it that the animal's autonomy is violated by both the research being done on them and in the future potential abuses of those technologies, but non-scientists who may use these for commercial purposes. And finally, I already alluded to this, so I'm going to spend less time on this. I'm just going to mention that there are serious harms, physical, psychological, communal, to individual animals and ecosystems associated with potential uses of this technology. So what's been interesting about this, and this I'm going to go to the principles now, is that in our experience, many scientists, including some, not all, and some, but not all of the collectives, are quite concerned about this. And certainly, I can speak only about SETI because they are the partners in this effort. In all of the interactions I've had, there's a lot of reflexivity happening about how to minimize the risks, for example, by developing what they call gentle technologies for tagging the animals, by minimizing other types of risks from recording and from the use of hydrophones or gliders and so on. But more broadly, at the workshop that we convened here at NYU, there were a number of researchers from other collectives and working on other species, and they were equally concerned about this. So SETI is the conversation started at least in this project, but this is widely shared in at least in the scientific community that we've been able to engage with. So I'll end then by laying out the principles here, and again, I'm just going to be able to mention there are 18 principles that we're developing. So I don't have the time, of course, to go into any depth into any of them, but I'm happy to elaborate on specific principles in the Q&A to the extent that I'm able, because as I said, this is still under review. So the most fascinating aspect of this work, which we have been doing for the last year, is that there's no ready-made framework that can be easily deployed and extended to NACTs. Of course, there are animal research ethical frameworks in different jurisdictions and academic contexts in the US versus Europe and so on, and we've looked at all of them. There's also IRBs, right? If we're serious about treating animals as subjects as opposed to objects, and we're drawing on human rights law, the question becomes, well, can we draw on human research principles to strengthen the protection of animals that are subject to this type of research? And then finally, we've looked at, because of the nature of the information being collected here, we've looked at AI safety guardrails. And the problem there, as you all know, is that they are few and far between. AI, at least in the US and most jurisdictions, not necessarily in Europe, is highly unregulated. So there is no AI framework that can be easily redeployed to put some guardrails on these technologies that also use AI among other technologies. So so this has been a difficult and laborious, but also fascinating process of trying to patch together ideas, insights from very different legal and ethical frameworks to try to address these challenges. So the principles will be divided into 4 categories. I'll start with the procedural ones because they're pretty straightforward, but they also are crucial. And by procedural responsibilities, we mean the how of the research and how the processes whereby remediation or dissemination of information is conducted. So the first one, and again, I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to go faster through this list, is transparency. We want to promote a spirit of transparency in divulging, of course, not only the findings, but the protocols that are used to minimize risks to animals in these research projects. One thing that has been interesting is the need to engage diverse and meaningful stakeholders. And by diverse and meaningful, we mean not only animal ethicists, although of course they're crucial, but in the case, for example, SETI has done a lot of work to engage local communities in Dominica, where they collect most of the data. In human rights law and in general in environmental law, giving people, if of course this is, if we could give the whales a chance to have a say on this, it would be ideal. But this is kind of a tautology. It's kind of it's a catch-22 here. You have to you have to have the research succeed for the whales or the animals to be able to have a say and for humans to understand what they're saying. But then in the meantime, who do you engage with? And our proposal here is that processes like the ones that exist for environmental impact assessments that give notice and time for people to have a say on key moments of the research is important. Then the burden of justification is more of a technical term to put the onus on the researchers to show that they are conducting the research according to these principles, not as opposed to whistleblowers or community members of animal welfare advocates. I already mentioned human communities as part of the stakeholders that should be engaged, although we do have a separate, because that's not as common in animal research. We wanted to have it as a specific principle. And finally, remediation. The process that we envisage, or the procedural conditions that we envisage, go from the beginning until the end of any research operation, including remediation, because harms are usually impossible to completely anticipate and avert. So this principle is about putting in place remediation protocols to address the harms that have been produced, and then try to avoid future similar harms. This is in human rights law called the non-repetition principle, meaning making sure that the harm doesn't repeat itself and remediating what has happened in the past. The second one is more substantive. So those were, the first batch is more procedural, as the title said. These are more on the substance side of things and the what. So process is how, and the substantive clauses or principles are the what. And we try to use language that we take from, again, from various um, frameworks, uh, but in some areas of human rights law, for example, the area of the rights of the child, without thinking that we're treating non-human animals as children, or that we're treating, like, depending on who you talk to, people might get offended if you talk to children's rights advocates and you say, well, we're using some of your tools to protect animals. They say, well, you're treating children like animals. And then you talk to the animal rights people and say, well, we're taking some ideas here from rights of children, and say, well, you're infantilizing the animals, right? But you know the idea here. The idea here, what we're trying to do is center the interest of the non-human animal, and because there will be conflict. There will be conflict. There's conflict where you have to determine as a scientific collective, an NACT collective, whether you move forward with the research or not, or whether and whether, if in the situation where different interests clash, right? The speed of your research versus the protection of the potential risks to the animal, you have to make a choice. And we're saying that, and this is the piece that we borrow from the Rights of the Child framework, that the guiding principle is to operate in the best interest of the animal, of the non-human animal. And that means protecting their autonomy. And we do have, by the way, each, of course, the document and the report that we're putting together in final form not only has the titles of the principles, but it has quite a bit of language about what each of the principles means and how it needs to be operationalized. So that's why it has taken us a lot of work and effort to turn into a publishable set of principles. And also, we have a long preamble and then an appendix with the sources and the sources of the principles we're distilling here. Autonomy, and this is, I'll just say for discussion, that this is a conundrum, right? Because by definition, NACTs have an impact on animals' autonomy, to at least to the extent that they entail heavy recording and monitoring of the animals, right? So oftentimes, scientists tend to be more comfortable with this, of course, because they have the technology and they're interested in the findings, and they need data in order to be able to make scientifically founded assertions about, this case, animal communication. But we've engaged with many other stakeholders, from community members, indigenous peoples with long-standing relationships with cetaceans, or philosophers, eco-philosophers. And not everyone is comfortable with the level of monitoring that happens, that is needed for this science to be conducted, right? Because it does require recording animal communication with all kinds of tools, right? From drones to hydrophones to gliders to then use of algorithms to try to determine how best to get to the animals and so on. So that level of surveillance is not comfortable to everyone, and we've taken that seriously. But I have to admit that this is kind of a definitional conundrum here, because it's in the nature of the technology, and what we're doing is trying in the principles to expand to the extent possible the non-invasiveness of the technology, and again, SETI has gone a long way in developing technologies that try to be as non-invasive as possible, but of course there are limits to what can be done. I already mentioned the best interest of the animal. This may be familiar to those of you who are probably experts in animal research ethics. And so the 3 Rs, everyone, when we would interview experts, everyone would mention the 3 Rs. So we now know about the 3 Rs as well. So in the spirit here being to replace, reduce, and refine the ways of doing research, so as to minimize harms to the animals. And then recognition. This has to do with recognizing the contribution of the non-human animal to the research findings. You may have read that people are experimenting with this, for example, with giving credit to the subjects of research as co-authors, and that hasn't gone very far. But we're working on a separate project in collaboration with the Biomimicry Institute that is not necessarily woven into the way that we're phrasing this principle, but we want to at least kind of put this on the list so that scientists think about how to address this question. The question is that we're working on with the Biomimicry Institute is, well, what if commercially advantageous findings, what if some of the findings end up being profitable? What if the technology and the findings on communication then lead to apps or to other commercial products that make scientists or the firms involved a considerable amount of money? What we're doing with biomimicry is finding ways, soft law ways, because there are no kind of formal ways whereby the law in any jurisdiction actually requires that, for example, and this is a real example that we've studied, a firm that developed an antibacterial coat and design for surfaces that was inspired by the Galapagos shark and shark skin, right? Because basically the design is taken from the skin, the design of the skin of the shark. There is no way to even invite those firms to pay back to the sharks in the form of some form of voluntary contribution to the protection of those ecosystems where the shark lives. So recognition of some sort of the contribution of the non-human animals to the research and ideally to the commercial uses of that research. I'll end, and I'm at time, so I'll end here by flagging the last group of principles and quickly just mention them. Prevention. A key principle, perhaps the fundamental principle in environmental law, is the precautionary principle. If environmental law brings anything to the table, is an ethics and an approach of caution, meaning that when in doubt, you should abstain, right? When there's not full certainty of the technology harming the animal, but there's indication that the technology may harm the animal, there's strong basis to think that that is the case, then precautionary measures should be taken. So that means identifying risks and analyzing them thoroughly. It means, as just said, operating with an ethics and an approach based on precaution. Then reducing spillover effects, as I think that is pretty straightforward, and making sure that downstream impacts are also taken into account in risk identification, in precaution, and in eventual remediation. And finally, this pretty standard risk mitigation, showing that the scientists not only identified and analyzed the risks, but that they took active measures to mitigate those risks from materializing and becoming and turning into actual harms to the animal. In implementation, I won't say much about this, and in fact, I'm going to put them all here because I'm conscious of time and I'm very interested in hearing from you all. And as I said, we're still working on the principles, so feedback is very helpful. This is just kind of a checklist to make sure that there are ways to verify that an external observer, be it an ethics board or a concerned citizen, can verify that the scientists using these technologies are taking this seriously. So the existence of an ethics protocol that can be accessed by anyone who's interested in the research, protocols for data governance and security. The question has arisen, well, who owns this data, and do the animals have any future say on the use of those data, just like supposedly human beings should have a say on data governance security. Continuous diligence and accountability. This is more process oriented. This is about keeping, making sure that the data is protected at every turn, and that the implementation is a continuous effort as opposed to an annual review or a very sporadic concern. And finally, some of these are probably obvious, but it's in the law. It's better to be explicit than to be implicit. So in this case, compliance with existing law is something that we wanted to flag here, because especially in the AI space, the idea that you need to move fast and think about the consequences and the existing legal guardrails is not always there. And one thing that we're adding based on the workshop feedback is that whenever a transnational scientific collective is made up of scientists operating under very different levels of stringency in ethics protocols, because their jurisdictions have different levels of stringency in those protocols, the principle here would be to abide by the framework that is most protective of the animals, and this is in line of the best interest of the animal principle. The idea here, and I'll end with this, is that we'll publish, and we'll be working with a Project SETI on this, and going back to the participants of the workshop that we organized here at NYU. After MOTH publishes a report with the final version of these principles, and we also, with Project SETI, distill a short version of the principles that would be endorsed not only by Project SETI, by whoever find this protocol helpful and is willing to abide by it. So I'll stop there, and happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Cesar. What a fascinating talk. It's such a pleasure to peer into the workings of this complex and critical undertaking. And it really feels as though there's been a growing public awareness of this topic, and perhaps greater institutional interest in tackling it as well. And I'm sure the audience has a lot to say about it and a lot of questions to ask. So just before we do open up the floor to discussion, comments or questions, I just wanted to remind everyone that they can add their remarks using either the chat function. So that's the chat icon on the bottom of the screen. And if you'd like to speak on the call, select the react icon, which is also at the bottom of the screen, and then the raise hand function, so I know who to call on and in what order. And also, please feel encouraged to introduce yourself and say a little something about your background when sharing your thoughts as well. Carrie, do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. What an amazing talk. Thank you for making it digestible for us to see all like the breadth of concerns in the legal conversation, because legal conversation is like mind blowing to me how detailed it needs to be, largely because of human language. So, in the spirit of looking at language and how our language affects the way we relate to other species, my question is about the concept and the ideology of collaboration. So, for example, what effect might it have if we look at a guardrail principle that research projects should be done in the spirit of collaboration with non-human life? And I'll give you kind of two examples of why I'm looking at this. One is a pretty well-known study of wolves that led to this notion of an alpha wolf. There was the research 25, 30 years ago, and I don't remember the man's name who did this, but he studied wolf packs and came up with this alpha male, alpha female framework for understanding their social hierarchy. Well, some years later, he went back and it turned out he had studied wolves in captivity. And when he went back and looked at wolves in the wild, he spent years trying to take his own work off of the bookshelves, because studying wolves in captivity was vastly different than studying wolves in the wild. And it just completely changed how humans relate, not only to the animals, but to ourselves. My second uh, example is looking at horses and equine assisted therapy. It's a very well known approach to let the horses have autonomy. Do the horses come up and participate in therapeutic work with people? And it's an incredibly different experience when horses have the option to feel their way into our scenario or to walk away at their own liberty. That's an example of what I would call collaboration with a non-human species. And so that's my curiosity, and my question is, if we frame our research in the light and the spirit of collaboration and we use that language, how might that contribute to the way research is built and presented and interpreted?
Should I come in now, Cristian, or later?
I can't quite hear you, Cesar.
Do you want me to answer the question or wait for more people to ask?
I think answering them, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's fascinating. I had not thought of this in those terms, although the idea of voluntary participation has come up, definitely. And there, because of course, in the spirit of respect and protection of autonomy, the question becomes, well, how do we make sure that animals are not forced into being a subject in this particular type of research, right? And when they're in the wild, the question is, do they want to be recorded, right? And I would have to think about it. In principle, I like the framework because it jives well with the idea of intersubjectivity that we're trying to hash out, meaning that this is a relationship between subjects as opposed to a relationship between one subject and one object, or one species that is seen as a subject, and then the other one is seen as a collection of objects. And the challenge, and so the spirit of collaboration would be the ultimate consequence of pushing the art principles to the highest level of protection, right? So what I would say is we're there aspirationally and also conceptually, and at the same time we have to deal with the very real constraints of how research happens, and because we want to make an impact on the world, because I see that Diana is here. She was here at the workshop, and I had the privilege of meeting her at one of SETI's meetings a couple of years ago, and these are leading scientists doing the real research, right? And even among the scientists doing NACTs, and especially technology groups doing this type of research, there are different approaches and different levels of concern and different levels of care about this. So we're trying to be to push the envelope in the direction of the protection of the animals, while acknowledging that this research is happening, and that demanding a spirit of collaboration from the get-go would probably move us in the direction of such a maximalist posture that no one would pay attention, right? So it's kind of being pragmatically principled. But I like the formulation. I like the approach, and it is very much in line with what MOTH, I'll speak for MOTH, wants to bring to these conversations. So thank you for that, and I'll certainly bring it to the team.
Wonderful. Maisie, go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you, César, first of all, thank you for doing this work. I've been following from afar some of the work of people using machine learning in animals and Project SETI, and been hoping that somebody would come and do this work because I've worried about it for a while. So yeah, really glad you're doing it. I'm really fascinated to hear that you had a sociological background. And I'm a sociologist, so I'm a sociologist in human-animal relations from the University of Manchester. And I study animal behaviour experts. So I'm going to ask you a question that's at a bit of a tangent, maybe from the legal and ethical principle. But I would suggest related, which is, I wonder how cetologists, and I'm using that word broadly, so both the scientists that you're working with, but also perhaps local or indigenous people who consider themselves to have a very close relationship with the sperm whales. I wonder how they feel about what must surely be a changing relationship with those whales. Because I guess on the one hand, there's a possibility of it being more, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess on the one hand, there's the vast possibility of it being more removed, because you can analyze this auditory data that is coming at you in your office in Ottawa or wherever it is from parts of the ocean tens of thousands of miles away. But on the other hand, there's this incredible intimacy where you can listen to a whale giving birth or whatever it is. And so I guess I'm fascinated by what your participants were telling you about that, and if they were, and how the practice of cetology might change as a result, as new generations come through who are increasingly using these technologies. And do you see any kind of ethical foretellings in that at all, I wonder?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ibor, for that question. It's and I'm glad that I'm not the only social scientist in the room. It is a really fascinating and multi-layered question. I've been reading. I want to write about why people are interested and fascinated by these questions of animal rights and rights of nature and whales. I'm the lawyer. With my lawyer's hat, I'm trying to contribute to actually fleshing out some principles that may be useful for the protection of the animals and the advancement of the rights. But as a sociologist, I'm wondering why are folks so fascinated with this research and with the question of what it means to protect these kind of these beings whose behavior, whose language is being kind of unveiled by all these new technologies, right? There's a beautiful book about called Fathoms that asks just that question. Why the fascination? I mean, probably those of you who work with dolphins or whales all the time may have better answers, right? Why this moment when we're losing as human beings many of our kins in other species to massive extinctions, are we so fascinated with how they speak or how they behave and how they mate and so on? So for the ethologists and for many individuals that I've worked, that I've talked to, not just for the Guardrails project, but for the Opportunities paper for the last couple of years, I think that people are torn. That would be my short answer to your question. I have heard loud and clear from some of the marine biologists who have been listening to whales and to cetaceans for the longest time. This is not new. I mean, there have been people who have been doing this for decades. And by the way, who continue to find patterns without the technology, right? So many of these patterns, the technology has added to the knowledge that marine biologists had. And by the way, as we know, without that careful listening with the sympathetic and trained human ear, this new science would not be possible. And without recording years and years of communications of whales and other animals, there would be no data, right? Now the data is increasing. So some of those individuals feel that they're losing something by using so much tech. That there's something to the direct contact, and the direct listening and the patient communication. You mentioned indigenous peoples. A new line of work that we are launching, starting with the MOTH gathering this year, is working with indigenous nations who have been in communication with whales for centuries, if not millennia, right? There was spent some time in New Zealand, for instance, where the idea, the foundational origin story of the whale rider is fundamental to the Maori and many other Polynesian peoples, right? So, and because we are lucky not to be wedded to the strictures of the natural science research, we want to pursue the question, right? How do they communicate? How do they understand? How have they related to those animals in ways that, and this is our potential contribution to this world of natural science, of biology and ethology, that may inform how technologies relate to the whales in the future. Now, having said that, so just to end, having said that, there's this discomfort with all the tech that is involved in it. There's in the part of some of the old timers in well research that I've talked to. Also for eco-philosophers, and we had my colleague and close colleague and collaborator David Abram, who wrote a fantastic book on the More Than Human World like 20 years ago that was crucial to deep ecology. Well, he's immensely uncomfortable with all of this. He's fascinated because, well, look at what could they be saying, but he also feels that technology always creates a form of mediation that makes meaningful engagement almost impossible, right? That it all becomes about the technology, and I personally go back and forth. So you're asking me about the people I've talked to. I would say there's definitely discomfort. There are also other people, and you may have seen that they have some of them have spoken very publicly about these people who are based in Silicon Valley, who are immensely enthusiastic about this, right? Because data is data, right? Data is data. So more research, more data is better than less data. More tech is always better than less tech, and I don't have to explain to you why that is problematic. And I think that this field, both in terms of its composition, in terms of the makeup of the teams, in terms of the makeup of the field, is all over the place in that kind of continuum of positions, of saying this we're losing more than we're gaining to these technologies, and to those that say, look, this is our opportunity to break the interspecies communication barrier, and this is for the best for everyone involved. If you asked, that would be a fascinating research project for you to embark on, right? Like so ask people, so what is it? I see that people are torn and that they're active, and that although I haven't been privy to any real kind of debate about this, in talking to individuals, I see very different positions among them.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Thank you. Great answer.
Lisa, go ahead. Lisa, would you like to post your question?
Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry about that.
First, yeah, thank you so much. This has been really lovely. I think one, being in this community of discussion, all of us coming at it from our own perspectives, but also kind of this framing from a legal perspective, which I don't get very often. So I'm a designer. For a long time, I've worked with equity-seeking people, and now my practice has emerged into working with equity-seeking species. And so a lot of what I deal with in my research is this question of the ethics around consent. And I'm curious, well, I have two questions. I'm going to ask my first one because it may be outside of the scope of maybe your field, but maybe not. I'm interested in ideas around listening at different timescales. So like a lot of these species don't speak at the rate of necessarily human conception. So I'm wondering if you're doing any work or if there's any legal frameworks around listening in different temporalities necessarily. And the other piece is kind of this thing of the ethics of how consent is offered. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the connection between the support of Indigenous communities and how that connects, because you touched on it just a moment ago, how that connects with the work you're doing around the ethics of consent with the natural world. Is there something happening together between that legal work that you're doing to increase the voice of both those communities?
Yeah. Thank you for both questions. I'll be very quick because I'm mindful of time. On time scales, listening in different time scales. I definitely haven't done any of that, but one of the most fascinating findings that I've been exposed to in the SETI Collective by one of the co-authors of this paper, forthcoming paper, Gasper Begus, is he also has found some of the most interesting patterns that he's written about for SETI without much tech, right? So it's by having a trained ear for dead languages. So he said, so he's kind of developed an ear for the patterns of the codas of the whale, right? And he does that mostly by slowing down or speeding up the vocalizations, like radically, and he continues to dig up patterns both with his ear and but with technology that all it does is like speed up or slow down the communications among the sperm whales or the vocalization. And then consent, so I look him up and see if you can get a hold of his research. And then on consent, yes, definitely. That is an area that I personally feel comfortable with. I come to environmental law from an indigenous rights background, and I've worked quite a bit with indigenous peoples of the Amazon for 20 years now. So there's an interest in the central concept and institution of international indigenous rights law the last 30 years or so is FPIC. It's free, prior, and informed consultation and consent, right? So definitely for indigenous peoples who have had this long-standing relationship with whales, and that is something that we're absolutely interested in applying because that's the law. But also, when I hear about people wanting scientists obtain consent of the subjects of the animals, it resonates, it brings echoes of FPIC, right? So what would be equivalent of obtaining free, prior, and informed consent, right? Or voluntary participation, as Carrie said.
Thank you so much. I have a question, and I think it kind of ties together maybe some of the topics related to Indigenous communities and another question posed in the chat by Danilo. To me, it seems like there are some parallels between developing regulatory templates for non-humans and maybe previous attempts to do so for humans that were unrecognized by or underrepresented in much of Western law, so, namely Indigenous peoples. And it makes me think of something like UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and sort of, this decades-long process of first establishing the initiative to produce a document protecting Indigenous peoples' rights in the first place, and its development, adoption, and passing by the UN, and now that, this ongoing challenge of enforcing or applying this framework in legally binding ways across jurisdictions. So I was curious if you foresee a regulatory framework for NACTs developing in a similar kind of way, if there are, maybe international organizations that you see playing a critical role in this process, maybe what kinds of challenges might arise when it comes to actually enforcing these principles or standards. I don't know, are there lessons from other legal struggles with Indigenous people's rights that MOTH has learned from, where do these domains overlap? And as Danilo asks in the chat, what would be a potential future scenario that would make you feel that your work or MOTH's has been successful? I know it's a lot of questions, but yeah.
Oh, thank you for that, those questions, Cristian. The good thing is that we do have kind of a clear answer to them, and basically yes. In the first one, one of the many sources that we've used for developing these principles are the protocols that have been used and developed over the years for engagements with Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, because it's involuntary isolation, because Indigenous people that have not been contacted and who do not want to be contacted. And again, in the Amazon, there are some groups of that sort. So anthropologists have had to deal with the question of well, if we're in nearby territories, working in nearby territories, how do we put signs and kind of around the borders of that territory for us to communicate with them that this is where the other Indigenous people's territory begins, right? So if they don't know the language, if they don't know how to communicate with them, right? So it's a question of intelligibility across different linguistic universes. So we've looked into that, and some of that has been very helpful. Of course, you always have to be careful about how much you can extrapolate from humans to non-human animals and so on, but that's certainly something that we have looked into. Then the question of institutionalization is also important. That is something that we also can be helpful in, because MOTH can be helpful in, because we worked not only on Indigenous people's rights, but on the formalization and consolidation of new regulatory frameworks on other things like business and human rights and others. And the way to go, and we hope that there will be enough interest and energy and in the scientific community and in the NACT community to go down one of the well-known routes. For now, we're proposing this set of principles as a completely voluntary initiative that people may choose to endorse, just as you choose to endorse a declaration or a statement. If there's interest, if there's enough energy, then there are ways that this can be institutionalized in the form of some sort of consortium. It could be like in the codes of conduct world, there are for some consortia of companies that abide by a certain set of rules when, for example, when they do business in the world, by not, for example, paying bribes, or that commit to upholding labor rights no matter where they operate. And this still in the realm of voluntary commitments. And that, to be completely realistic, that is as far as, quite frankly, the world can go these days, because there is no appetite for new treaties, no appetite for new hard laws. So we need to make do with soft laws, but those soft laws do make a difference. My PhD dissertation was on codes of conduct for labor in the apparel industry, and trying to protect workers from abuse in sweatshops around the world. And those were all soft law mechanisms. They did make an impact. So that would be kind of the way forward if there's appetite to go beyond the principle.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your answer. Diana.
Yeah, hi everybody. Hi Cesar. Thank you for a really provocative and wonderful talk, and thanks for all the terrific work your group and SETI are doing. It was a pleasure for me to be part of that NYU workshop. I was there representing Interspecies Internet, and also as a scientist. So I just wanted to add just a little bit here. I don't want to take too much time, but I want to follow up on what you were saying just now. I think one of the keys that I want to stress, and this is as a person who has been working with marine mammals for a long time, I've tried to do what we call translational science, which is using the discoveries we find and then reporting back to a more global audience about who these animals are, not that they're not what they are, but who they are. And often I think that these close encounters we have with them, whether it's been working with them in aquariums or in the wild, I do both, really give you this rich picture of who they are. And I think this is critical. I'm speaking for scientists right now in changing how we treat them. I think there's agreement that if we can show that they have different personalities, that they have awareness, both socially and self-awareness, it's important. But the point I want to make beyond that, which is, again, following up on what you're saying, Cesar, is to find also a way to partner with more organizations, how to make these win-win situations for everybody. And I think it's a real key. I was involved many years ago in the dolphin tuna issue that led to dolphin safe tuna. We've been working to try to stop the dolphin drive hunts, which have not been successful, as most of you know. But now Roger Payne, who's passed away recently, got me involved in working in Mexico to try to save the vaquita. And the point I'm going to make now is that finally people are working with the government in Mexico, and we're getting places little by little. I think it's finding these partnerships and showing people that there's something that everybody benefits, the non-humans and the humans. And I think if we can focus on that more and more, we have a chance to make a difference. Yeah, I think it's really critical. So I think that the spirit that you're coming to this with, Cesar, and the group, I think is really good in having these kinds of open conversations about this now, bringing more people in to help us all think about how we can be better. The other thing, I'll give you a very specific example with scientists. When we first started doing our research with dolphins in Bimini and Belize, particularly in Belize, we were using drones. We wanted to use drones to get an aerial view and not disturb them even with our boats, because when the boat motors come up, often you can't get good recordings, and you disrupt them, frankly, even in a small boat. But we had to find out if the drones would be disruptive. So we flew them at high areas, and we published a paper showing it didn't seem to get any response, except for maybe one or two very brief ones from the animals. But when we tried this with a different marine mammal, the manatee, it was incredibly disruptive. And then you think about what their environments are like and how much noise travels through and what their past history. So I think it's on us scientists to try to find the least invasive ways, the least disturbing ways for these animals. And that gets into how good an observer we become. What are the subtle signals we look for? And again, I don't have the answers to that at all, but I think we do have to be responsible as scientists. And I think most scientists I know who study cetaceans want to be responsible in this. So I think there'll be a good audience for this. And I just want to say thanks so much again for all the work you're doing.
Thank you, Diana, and thanks for all your contributions at the workshop. And of course, as Diana said, the purpose behind kind of Diana's participation, our invitation to Interspecies, was to very much partner in this process. We have kind of the advantage of not being one of the NACTs creators, but we're very much interested in this field, kind of abiding by guardrails that can help everyone do research in an ethical and in a thoughtful way. And partnership is crucial. We had a number of other scientists in that workshop, and this is why also we're going to open it up once this group of participants takes a look at it and hopefully decides to endorse it. Then we're going to open it up for more endorsements. This is and going back to Cristian's questions and now to Diana's question, the only way to institutionalize any of this, the only way for it to be robust and resilient, is to have buy-in from a number of stakeholders and actors in local communities, scientists in different jurisdictions and in different academic milieux. So we're throwing this out there, doing it hopefully in a thoughtful way, but it is the proof of its usefulness will be whether different organizations find it helpful and they're willing to endorse the principle. So that's very much our hope, and this is the effort that we're making.
Wonderful. I think in the interest of time, this might be a good place to close, also with this reminder of the importance of partnerships between scientists and the broader community, and a focus on the mutual flourishing of human and non-human relations. So thank you all for such a fascinating discussion. Thank you, César, for taking the time to share your important work with us. If you'd like to stay up to date with MOTH online, I'm going to post a couple links in the chat. Their website and Instagram account. Thank you so much to the Interspecies Internet community for showing up to this talk. We're always so grateful for the engagement and your interest in our programming. And if you'd like to learn more about our organization or stay up to date with our lecture schedule and other events, projects, and activities, maybe connect with a community of researchers and enthusiasts, then please follow us on social media, visit our YouTube, join our Slack, or subscribe to our newsletter. I think our General Assistant Carolina has shared these links with everyone in the chat. So once again, on behalf of Interspecies Internet, the trustees, and our community, thank you very much, César, for the wonderful lecture. Thanks to everyone in attendance, and we look forward to seeing you in a few weeks for our next Interspecies Conversations event.
Thank you so much.